Take it away, Andrew.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, like Donald said, I volunteered to host this month's small firm forum meeting. And I'm really happy to see so many attendees interested in the same subject that I'm interested in. You know, if you're like me, there have been at least 2 or 3 situations in your practice where surveying became like a really hairy issue and you really wish that you knew more about it to advise your clients and strategize and figure out how to deal with whatever the problem was. That's what came to mind when Donald put out the call for volunteers to organize events for 2022. So here we are. And I'm very happy to introduce Jackie Luck to all of you. Hopefully when you got the announcement for today's program, you took a look at her website. I'll just try and say a few words of introduction. It's basically just straight from her bio page on her website. She's got a very impressive CV. She's both a civil engineer and a licensed surveyor. She holds degrees from Berkeley in civil engineering and a BS in something called geomatics engineering from Cal State Fresno. And I don't know what that means, so that's kind of interesting. She runs her own firm in Richmond and has a very impressive project list and a list of services that she offers. She has worked on some large-scale projects that we've all heard of, multifamily housing. She works with governments. It seems like all over the Bay Area, Jackie, if I'm correct, and has a number of people on her staff. So I look at a website like this and I ask myself, how does this person do it? I think we are in very good hands to have someone give us a primer on surveying. And I asked Jackie about this before we got started. For all of you who are watching, if you have questions, feel free to use the chat box on your screen and type questions. And Jackie will keep an eye on the chat column. And as it fits in with her talk, she'll answer questions either kind of in midstream or she may save them towards the end. But feel free to throw questions out there using the chat box while she's talking. Okay. And with that, Jackie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, for the intro.
Sure.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for having me. I'm excited to talk to you all today about surveying. Andrew already gave the intro on me. I guess the only thing I'll also say is this company was originally my dad's company. He retired about 9 years ago. So he brought me and my sister in to start doing drafting in AutoCAD when I was 9 years old. And so I've been breathing and living surveying and engineering and AutoCAD since I was a little girl. So excited to share a little bit of that with you. So today we're just going to talk about types of surveys, subdivisions, other survey matters, and open it up to discussion and questions. So the basic types of surveys there are a topographic survey, which is basically locating site features and elevations. A boundary survey, which is establishing property line locations based on a legal description, which is what basically establishes where the property lines are. And then an ALTA survey is basically a specialized type of topo and boundary survey that adheres to a set of standards. So I'll touch on all of those briefly. So a topographic survey locates site features basically both horizontally and vertically. So where is there a building, a fence line, curb, gutter, driveway, those kinds of things. And so one aspect is the horizontal location of it. And then the other aspect is vertical. So not all surveys require this, but sometimes you'll be interested in knowing what the finished floor elevation of a building is, or what the elevation is of a curb relative to something in the back of a lot. And typically when we provide elevations on a survey, we do it relative to a benchmark. Cities will publish benchmark information, as do counties. There's also national benchmarks. So for example, if a property is located in a flood zone where FEMA has a flood map that publishes a base flood elevation, that's typically tied to the vertical datum NAVD 88. And so if you want to know whether a house, floor elevation, an existing house is above the floodplain, then you would want your surveyor to tie into an NAVD 88 benchmark in order to be able to essentially compare the elevations relative to the FEMA map. The level of detail required on topographic survey really depends on the purpose of the survey. As Andrew mentioned, we do a lot of affordable housing in the Bay Area, and sometimes those developers are, they're purchasing fully improved property, or where they're refinancing it. And so they just need a basic survey just showing what the site features are on the property. So in that case, we wouldn't get a lot of detail, and maybe we would just show the basic site features and not obtain elevations. If you're doing new construction on let's say an infill lot in Oakland, then maybe you don't need a lot of detail for everything in the interior of the lot because it's all going to be demoed, but you're particularly interested in elevations around the limit of work and obviously in the right of way, and what the depths of utilities are in the right of way that we would tie into. For a rehab project, maybe the scope is more targeted to only where the area that you're planning on doing improvements. Lately, we've been doing a lot of surveys for properties, single family homes who want to convert an accessory building to an ADU. Oftentimes in that kind of case, you only really need a boundary survey, which shows where the property lines are located and surveys, the fence lines and the existing buildings relative to the property line, so the city can see that, an accessory building is within a setback or outside the setback, that kind of thing. A boundary survey, the purpose of the boundary survey is to establish the property line locations, identify any easements or rights of way, and also identify any boundary issues. So boundary issues might be, are there gaps or overlaps in title? Are there any errors in the legal description? Are there any encroachments onto the property based on the result location of the boundary? And the way in which we determine where the property line locations are is based on a bunch of evidence. So the first thing we always ask when an architect or a homeowner asks us for a quote for a survey is, do you have the grant deed or the title report? And the reason why we ask for that is that both of these documents contain the legal description of the property, which is what we use to determine where the property lines are. We also look to these other types of maps, assessors maps, monument maps, record maps. And then of course we go out in the field and collect field survey data. And we kind of look at all of this evidence in total in order to determine where the property lines are located. So I'll go through kind of a couple samples of each of these. So this is a grant deed. Typically the grant deed will have the assessor's parcel number. It'll show the address of the property. And then it'll basically be a grant from the previous owner to the current owners. And at the bottom of it will usually have the legal description of the property. So that's what we as surveyors are looking for when we're asking for the grant deed. Typically, this is what the homeowner receives after they buy the property. It's mailed to them by the county after it gets recorded at the county. Grant deeds can describe property in two ways. They can describe them as a lot and block legal description, which is shown here. So it's basically this property in Danville is described as lot 132 as shown on the subdivision map, which was recorded in 1973. The other way that grant deeds can describe property is through a meets and bounds legal description. So this is a sample of one that's in Orinda. And rather than referring to a lot and block on a subdivision map, it is saying, it describes the point of beginning, and then it says, thence from that point of beginning, 214 feet to the northwest line of this deed from 1948. And then it goes another few courses, and then it says thence to 204 feet to the exterior line of the parcel of land described in this other deed from 1946. So generally, a parcel that is described with a meets and bounds legal description is usually harder to retrace the property boundary than something that's a long block. Just because, as you can see, just looking at this legal description, if I were to try to retrace this boundary, I'm not just looking at this deed and then looking at the one map that refers to the deed. I'm now pulling these deeds from 1948 and 1946 and having to retrace those property boundaries in order to determine where my lot line is. So that's where when we price boundary surveys, we always want to see the legal descriptions of the property, because depending on how they're described can make the price of the boundary resolution vary by quite a bit. This is a copy of a preliminary title report. Usually homeowners will receive this as part of their disclosures when they're in contract to buy a property. It'll always be issued by a title company. Usually says preliminary report. Will have the property address. It'll say how title in the land is held. So fee simple here basically means they own the land completely. Whereas an easement means they don't actually own the land that's being described, but they own easement rights, such as for access across the land. And then always within the title report, it will have the legal description. So this is the second page of the title report, which shows the APN and shows parcel 1 being lot 30 of a particular tract map filed in 2000. And then parcels 2 and 3 are the easements that are called appurtenant to the parcel. What that means is that these easements, when they're within the legal description of the property, they're easements that are not within the parcel, they are outside of the parcel, and whoever is the owner of lot 30 also has rights across these other portions of land. The thing that a title report will have that a grant deed will not have is it will show all of the exceptions to title. And the exceptions to title will be any easements or encumbrances that affect the property. So Andrew, you had sent me a question from someone that said, you know, can I rely on a surveyor to do a thorough title search and convey all info relating to a property and show all easements? The answer to that is the only way that we as surveyors know what affects the property is by having a title report. We don't have a way of like pooling all of the deeds affecting a parcel. Basically, that's the title company's job when they produce the title report. So that's why we always request the title report. Oftentimes when we're doing single family home surveys, we'll ask for both. The homeowner may only have the grant deed or they may not have the grant deed at all, and we will need to pull the grant deed from county records. In that case, we can only show the boundaries, meaning the exterior property lines of the parcel based on the grant deed. And we usually just put a disclaimer on our survey that says, you know, we haven't seen or reviewed a title report, so we can't say whether or not there are any easements on the property, because we really can only get that from a title report. Assessors maps are another form of map that we use as evidence. It's usually published by the county that the property is located in. It will show the dimensions of the parcel and also the dimensions of all of the parcels on the block. And so it's important to note that assessors maps are not recorded documents. They're used by, as the name suggests, the assessor's office for tax purposes. So they're really used as a guide. There are often, not often, but sometimes inaccuracies in parcel maps because they're just kind of quickly reading the deed and transposing the dimensions on the deed, but they're not. So when there is a record map that conflicts with the assessor's map, the record map will always govern over the assessor's map. Certain cities publish monument maps. So San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley have monument maps. I think there's a question in the chat about where are monuments and where do you find them? The city of Oakland, San Francisco, and Berkeley, the ones for San Francisco are published on a website. Oakland and Berkeley, you have to email the surveyor's office to get them. But I don't know that, I don't know that you as an architect would necessarily have a great need for obtaining these, because they're really for the use of the surveyor in determining where the property boundaries are. The monument maps are used to determine where right-of-way lines are for the city. So here, for this one in San Francisco, I'm zooming in on a corner of this monument map. So basically, this is saying that in this upper right corner, there's a mark on a building, on a 9-story building, on the corner of this 9-story building, 1 foot up. And that mark is located 31.89 feet from the monument line. So as a surveyor retracing the property boundary, let's say our property is, on this block, then we would locate three or four monuments on Post Street, 3 or 4 monuments on this perpendicular street, and we would use, we would use the distances of those monuments shown on the map to retrace these monument lines, and then offset the distances shown on this map to establish the right-of-way lines of these respective streets. Here's a sample of a map in Oakland. So if we zoom in on a particular block, if we were trying to determine where the property boundary were for a house on this block, the monuments that are circled, those are the monuments that are within the street intersections. So we would locate those monuments. What's boxed, so this 5N and 5W on the right-hand side, that means that the monument line that is the monument line of Arlington Street and of Los Angeles Street is located 5 foot north and 5 foot west of the center line. So if we were to need to establish the right-of-way line of Los Angeles and 57 of the whole block, really. So for Arlington, for example, let's say we located these 2 circled monuments, we draw a line connecting those 2, offset the line 5 feet to the south to establish the center line of Arlington, and then offset that line another 25 feet if this is a 50-foot wide street, and that would establish the south right-of-way line of Arlington. And we would do the same for the surrounding streets. Record maps are also what we use to determine property lines. So this is a recorded subdivision map. And if our goal was to establish the property line of lot 30, which is boxed in red, we would look to locate in the field the monuments that are circled. And then on this map, it shows the bearings and distances between the monuments, and it shows ties to the right-of-way lines of Carina Court, which we would then use and basically retrace the property line of lot 30. So when we first do our boundary survey work, the first part of it is gathering all of this evidence, the monument maps, the record maps, and reviewing all of that. And then we basically set up our game plan for what field survey we obtain in the field. So mostly that is locating monuments. Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention back here. So oftentimes in cities and in counties that don't have monuments, let's say it's, for example, in El Cerrito, Richmond, a lot of places that have these rectangular blocks, but they have no monument maps, then in the absence of monuments, in order to establish the right-of-way lines, we survey improvements instead. So what we would do is we would survey the face of curb on both sides and back a sidewalk on both sides of Arlington, Los Angeles, 57th and Gaskill. And essentially we do a split of improvements to establish the center line of those streets. And then we offset that center line by 25 feet to get the right-of-way line. So that happens very commonly in the absence of monuments. So we go on the field and we look for all the monuments that are either maintained by the county or city, shown on record maps, or set by private surveyors as shown on corner records or records of survey, all of which are typically on file with the county that the property is located in. And then we also survey evidence of improvements such as fence lines, top of curb, and back of sidewalk. So fence lines are not where the property line is located, but they are an indication of where a property line is believed to be. And so that's not, fence lines are not taken with the same weight as monuments are, but in the absence of monuments, we still use fence lines as evidence to determine where the property lines are. So when surveyors talk about determining property lines, we call it a boundary resolution. The reason why we call it that is, it's not, we always say if you hire 10 different surveyors, they may come up with 10 different solutions because we are, weighing all of this evidence together, and most of the time it should not differ by more than an inch or two here and there, but it really depends on the case in terms of how much ambiguity there is, whether there are monuments, or whether we're relying solely on improvements in order to determine those property line locations. All right, so let's jump into a few examples. And just addressing some of the questions real quick. Do earthquakes move monuments? They can. It depends on how well cities maintain their monument maps. But generally, to be honest, in the city of San Francisco, we have not seen monuments move too much. Like we've really, and that's kind of why we also always survey like 3 or 4 monuments per street, because then we can see whether one might appear to be off and that we can't use it. Another question, how do you measure when a paved road has no curbs? When there are no curbs, we typically measure the edge of the roadway on both sides. So the edge of the AC pavement instead as the evidence of the roadway, and then we establish the center line from there. Let's see, I've had title companies tell me only a surveyor can confirm exact locations of easements. That is correct. So the title company will be able to tell you whether or not there is a recorded easement on the property. So whether there's a document recorded against the property that memorializes the easement. We as the surveyor are not going to be able to determine that independently. We rely on the title company to produce that document. Once we have that document, we would, just like we review a legal description for a property to determine the property boundaries, we would also review that legal description and plot out that easement on the survey. But without having the survey, without having that easement document itself, we wouldn't know that that exists. Okay, so. All right, so let's just go through a few examples. So the first is actually the monument map that we were just looking at in Oakland. So it's a single family home that is in Oakland. And I think their intent is to build an ADU in their backyard. So the scope of this survey was just a boundary survey to understand where the existing improvements are relative to the property line. And so this is the grant deed we received from the homeowner. This is the Assessors Map here, and then this is the monument map that we were just looking at. So if we start at the legal description up here, it's basically saying we're beginning at a point on the northerly line of 57th Street, and we're going 80 with the intersection of Los Angeles, and then we're going 80 feet westerly to the point of beginning of this lot. Then we're running 40 feet along 40th Street and then going at right angles, 100 feet, 40 feet, 100 feet, back down to the point of beginning. So what I was describing earlier was, we locate 2 or 3 monuments in Los Angeles, and we locate up 2 or 3 along 57, and then we try to basically locate these monuments from the monument map so that we could reestablish this block, right? And then because this is a meets and bounds description, it has a point of beginning. So it starts at a point of commencement from this corner, and then it goes over. So basically, once we establish the monument lines and the right-of-way lines from 57th and Los Angeles, then we can essentially put back this parcel. The reason why the assessor's map is important is because sometimes if it's just a lot and block description, right? So let's say this is just referring to lot 18 of this block from this map from 1890, right? And if we don't have monuments, or if we do, we may find that the measured overall dimension of the block is different, less or more than the record dimension. So the overall dimension of the block might be on this 1890 map is 600, whereas when we measure in the field based on bisecting the curb or locating the monument lines, maybe it's 600.5. So the overall block is 6 inches larger than the record dimension. Then, depending on how the parcel is described, what we end up having to do is prorating the overage across all of these lots. So if there's an extra, 6 inches over 10 lots, then each lot would get an extra 500. So rather than it being 40 feet, it would be 40.05 feet because the block is bigger than the record dimension. So then this is what the final product of that survey looked like. So we're showing the monuments that we located on 57, ties from that monument line to the corner, and then the 80-foot dimension that was shown in the deed. And then this is the property boundary. And we're showing the building, the accessory building in the back, as well as dimensions from the building corners to the various property lines. So that's one example of a pretty limited scope of survey that we typically do. Here's another example. This is of a 10,000 square foot lot in Hayward that our client is looking to build a new single family home on. This is the title report we received from him with, this was what I showed previously, but it's just a lot and block legal description, lot 30 of this tract map. So basically all we have to do is more or less look at this tract map to establish the property boundaries. So this is the lot in question. These are the monuments that I showed on an earlier slide that we located. And then also on this map, they're showing, parcel A, which is a private street, Creena Court, has various easements across it. And then on the parcel itself, it has a 6-foot PUE, public utility easement. And basically everything that, all of the information in order to determine the property boundary is contained on this map. We locate the boundary, the monuments, and then we use the bearings and distances shown to retrace this property boundary. So this is what our final product looked on that. Obviously, because they were building a new home on the property, they need to know what the elevation is. This is a pretty steeply sloping lot. So they want to know how it slopes. And we are showing, the monuments we found, how we are tying to the property line. the easements on the property, and of course, all of the site features, the topography, and also, these parking spaces, the evidence of utilities that we find on the lot, and the elevations that we find. On the survey, we will often list a basis of bearings and a benchmark. Basis of bearings is basically how we came up with the bearings that are shown on this. In this case, it is pretty straightforward because we're matching the bearings that are shown on this map. On the 57th Street survey, nobody did a survey of this particular lot in the past, but somebody did do a survey of some other parcel where they did show the bearing between these two monuments. So in that case, our basis of bearings is the bearing between these two monuments taken as North 755442 East, as shown on this parcel map that was filed in 2019. So that's an example of where we're using a previously recorded map, information shown on there as evidence for, how we came up with the bearing for this parcel. And then the other piece of information on this survey is the benchmark, because of course we're showing elevations. And so, this is the benchmark that we used. It's a published benchmark by Alameda County with a specific elevation, and it specifies the datum, which is mean sea level. And so we located this benchmark and used it to establish the elevations for the property. Whenever we are showing elevations on property, it's possible that you can set what surveyors call a temporary benchmark, TDM, where they're just setting a mark in a nail in the sidewalk, and we say this is elevation 100. And so if that's the case, then the datum that is on is just an assumed datum, because we assigned an arbitrary elevation to this nail, and we're using everything that's shown on the survey is relative to that. We usually try, when possible, to tie into a benchmark that is published. Cities sometimes require it. So City of Oakland generally requires that surveys be tied to their datum so that they can, compare apples to apples. But oftentimes, if it's a survey that's for some limited purpose where you only need relative elevations, then you don't really need to go to the trouble of tying into an established datum, and an assumed datum is just fine. As I mentioned, like if it's something where a FEMA flood elevation is important, then it would be definitely necessary to tie into the NAVD 88 data. And then our last example. So this is a house. This is a bigger property. This is like 2.7 acres in Hillsborough. That's pretty heavily vegetated. And so this one, let's see, this is the legal description of the parcel. So, whenever it says beginning and has a lot of words, it's to the point of beginning. This is another example of a meets and bounds description. And just to show you like an example of how complicated it can get. So this is the parcel here. And in order to determine the property line of the parcel, we had to basically locate monuments pretty far away from the site in order to reestablish this property boundary. So this is the case where, and this sometimes happens this is a larger parcel, it's 2.7 acres, but it can be this complicated for a parcel that's 5,000 square feet, So when pricing for boundary surveys vary widely, this is one of the reasons why it does do that. And then in terms of the scope of the topographic survey, this homeowner was doing improvements to the property, but wasn't totally clear at the time of the start of the project, which was when we did the survey, where their improvements would be. And so we only basically, our base price and our, basically our initial go at it was only to survey essentially the existing improvements. So the roadway up to the house itself, and anything that had, an existing site feature like a wall or a fence or a building, anything like that. As they got further into design, they realized that they needed much more data. And so we ended up going back several times to get more topographic information as a result of needs from their architect and their civil engineer, so that, our final survey was something like this, where they needed a lot of tree information, they needed contours, that kind of thing. So I think there were a couple questions regarding scope that people had. What are the things that are expensive or not expensive? If you don't need to know elevation information, then that obviously adds cost. If you don't need to know where trees are located, that is obviously cost. For this particular project, because it was so heavily vegetated, our initial proposal totally excluded basically anything in dense areas of vegetation that we couldn't access. The clearer the site is from a site distance and sight lines point of view, the simpler it is for us to survey it. So if in terms of, I always get questions, how much do these things cost? How much do surveys cost? So, a survey like this, which is pretty straightforward, just establishing property boundaries. The cost of this, I think, was $2,800. The cost of this, which is, 10,000 square feet lot, but vacant, but a pretty straightforward boundary resolution, was about $5,000. And then, the cost to determine to the topographic and boundary survey here was, the space scope was something like 14,000. And then to do all this additional detail was an additional 8 or so. So that gives you kind of an idea of what pricing is based on the scope. Okay, so just looking at some of these questions. Okay, they're a little bit all over the place, so I think I might come back to the questions at the end. So let's see. Okay, so actually I will kind of answer some of these questions. So is our output digital, 2D, CAD, or any 3D software? So we typically, if we generate contours, then we can send that out as a 3D surface. But otherwise, for basic surveys where we're not generating contours, all of our information is issued in 2D CAD. So we would issue the boundary and the topo. The boundary is obviously 2D. The topo, unless we build a surface, will also be 2D line work. And then what we typically do is we issue a CAD file that contains all of the points that we survey. So those will not be elevated, but they can be converted to elevation should you need it. How are elevations typically gathered? How many points and what tools? So we use a total station to collect all of our data. And how many points? So how many points, it was really up to the architect or a homeowner to specify. So, in the case of the 57th Street, simple boundary survey, we didn't gather any elevations. we typically, when we shoot building corners, unless they are not, like we can't actually put the rod right next to the building corner, we will typically measure what the elevation is at ground level, just so we have that data. But sometimes we don't have the ability, let's say if it's, you know, in the corner and all we can see is up high, that building corner, then we'll shoot it reflectorless. And then the elevation that's reflected on our point will not be an actual elevation that represents a ground elevation. It'll just be a point on the building. Accuracy. So using the total station, the accuracy is plus or minus, you know, a couple hundredths. So plus or minus quarter inch or so. So it's pretty accurate. Does it cost a lot more to get surveying done in stages instead of all at once? Depends on the scope. So for that 57th Street survey, you know, we were going to spend, by the time we're out there once, because it's a small job, we can pretty much get everything that you need. Even if it were a full topographic and boundary survey, we could collect all of that data in a single day, right? Including doing the boundary resolution for the monuments, as well as whatever elevation information you need on the project. So there is only an incremental cost to getting that additional topographic survey info for the 57th Street job. For the Kenilworth job in Hillsborough, that big lot, it wasn't, even if they had included all of that scope at once, sure, there were a couple more trips to go out there, but the site was so large anyway that if we had to go get all of that data, we would have spent those additional days. So it's only a little bit more for it to be piecemeal, if that makes sense. Can elevations be determined from satellite data rather than having to find a monument that documents elevation? I have not used anything to date that from satellite that gives elevation. So that may exist, but I am not aware of it. Do boundary surveys include FEMA flood zones and elevations? No. So a boundary survey typically is limited to where the property lines are, and if a title report was provided, whether there are any easements. If you need to know whether the property is in a flood zone, that would be something that you would need to specifically ask the surveyor to determine. They can look it up on FEMA's website on their firm maps. And then if for example, there's a base flood elevation located adjacent to the site that you would need to verify, then they would have to, you know, tie into an NAB benchmark to determine the elevation of the existing house. With significant slope, do you measure on the ground and subsequently calculate the distance? No. So that is how it used to be done. I mean, the answer is yes, but it's all done automatically by the equipment. Basically, you know, there's a laser that goes from the total station to the rod, and it measures that distance and also measuring the angle. And so that's how it's getting the elevation and both the vertical and horizontal location of that point automatically. Question, how do you obtain the utility information? So we have to obtain that information by reaching out to the various utility purveyors. So anytime we do a survey, if that, like for example, if it's new construction of an affordable housing building, they need to know where the existing utilities are located, then we would contact City of Oakland for their sewer and storm maps, East Bay Mud for their water maps, PG&E for their gas and electric maps. And, you know, sometimes it takes some time for those utility companies to get back to us, and, you know, their maps are not always accurate. So, you know, we usually, when it's critical for design use, we will dip the sewer and storm, which are the gravity lines where we can, you know, open up the manholes and stick a rod in there to see how deep they are. That's how we would verify their actual locations in the field. And then for the remaining utilities that are not gravity utilities, they would just be based on their record location. So we only show their approximate locations. Sometimes it is critical to know exactly where they are, in which case an underground utility locator would have to be hired to mark the location of those utilities in the field. And then we would survey their markings. Can planting of a line of trees by one neighbor, albeit largely over the property line, effectively cause the other neighbor to lose rights? No. If the property is located on, like if the tree, if it's my property and my neighbor plants trees on my property, I still have the right to that property. So it's still my property. So I hope that answers your question, Frank. Use of land, such as neighbors on either side of a fence, where one thinks they own land to the fence, lead to the actual owner. Okay, so same question. So some of you may have heard of adverse possession. So, you know, let's say you own land and your neighbor's fence line is 2 feet onto your property. So that 2 feet of land they are occupying. Can the fact that they have occupied it for a long time mean that you no longer have rights to the land? The answer to that is no. Adverse possession is only a thing when it's like land that's unclaimed or it's an easement right across a property. You cannot adversely possess something to someone else's exclusive use when it doesn't belong to you. Can you recommend a way for architects to check the finished floor level of a given house and that of a finished home or ADU once it's built? Is there a simpler tool type that could help us get this info? Other than having a surveyor do it, I don't think there is. If you have access to a level, in theory, you could survey one elevation and see, like, let's say of the house, and then you could survey what the finished floor was of the ADU is relative to it. But you would need some sort of reference elevation if you needed to understand what it was in an absolute sense. Is there a public record source of info online, such as a GIS map, that would allow an architect to make a preliminary assessment of probable property lines? So the record info that most architects, I believe, use and that we use is the Assessors Map to determine where property lines are. And then if you want to kind of get more nitty gritty than that, then you could look into where, like, let's say you look at the legal description of the property and it refers to a subdivision map, then you could go to the county website. Some counties have all recorded maps on their website available for anybody to download. So you could download that yourself to see where that lot is and, you know, where monuments might be close by. But if you were to download that subdivision map, that could be how you retrace the actual, you know, bearings and distances and of that lot without, so you could still get the paper boundary without knowing where it is in the field. The purpose of hiring a surveyor is really understanding, okay, here's where the paper boundary is in the field. Where is that property line? Because obviously a property line you can't see it on the ground, right? So the purpose of the boundary survey is understanding where the property line is relative to the fixed improvements. So let's see. Can you explain what each symbol means on the survey map and walk through the meets and bounds description more completely with the survey map? I can try to do that. I think we'll save that if we have time for the end. We can certainly do that, but I'm sort of getting into the weeds a little bit that for the surveying, so I'm not sure how useful it is to everybody. Spencer's question, do new topographic and boundary surveys between part of the public record that anyone can access, any way for new homeowners to access previously completed survey? Unfortunately, the answer to that is no, unless a record of survey is recorded, then the survey is not in a public record. And I think there's a lot of other questions about records of survey, which we'll get into in a little bit later. And Andrew's question, is the second surveyor bound to the findings of the first surveyor? The answer to that is no. The second, boundary retracement is called retracement for a reason. We're trying to retrace the footsteps of the original surveyor who wrote the legal description, who you know, first established the property boundary. That being said, there may be, you know, let's say that property boundary was established in 1900. Since then, maybe there have been multiple subdivision maps or records of surveys that have been recorded pertaining to the parcel or around that parcel. What I mentioned earlier about weighing all of the evidence, you know, if there already has been a survey, but the second surveyor finds evidence that there might have been a blunder in the map or something else, then it may not be that they have to hold the first survey. You know, it is just an opinion of a surveyor, hopefully based in fact, but each surveyor is bound to sort of do their own fact finding to come up with their solution. Okay, so I think I covered a decent number of the questions. I know there are still some outstanding ones about the record of survey, so I'll get to that a little bit later. So continuing on. And this stuff we'll cover pretty quickly. I'm not sure how many people are interested in knowing about ALTA surveys. We encounter a lot of this in our, you know, multifamily affordable housing work. ALTA survey is really just a topographic and boundary survey, but it adheres to certain standards. So we have to identify encroachments. There's, as part of the ALTA standards, there's this list called Table A that has optional items that include, you know, listing the flood zone, what the zoning of the property is, listing building dimensions, height, area, and observe evidence of recent construction, changes to street right-of-way. Oftentimes, the ALTA survey is required to be certified to certain parties and has to have a date within 30 days of closing for whatever reason. ALTA surveys are typically required to as due diligence when a property is being purchased or refinanced. This is pretty common in a lot of our projects where a lender or title insurer will require an ALTA survey to be done. And they are done often in multiple stages: at acquisition, when the property is purchased, at construction closing, there's often an update required by the lender. Sometimes we do an ALTA pro forma, which is, let's say it's an affordable housing project that's recording an airspace parcel map. The lender wants to see what does the condition of the property look like after closing, and oftentimes on these types of deals, the parcel map gets recorded at closing because it's a complicated transaction where you know, the city owns the land, is transferring it to a nonprofit developer, and so the map there's like a, you know, an order in which documents record, and the map can only record, you know, subsequent to the transfer. And so then we would produce an ALTA survey based on a titled pro forma report that shows the condition of the property after closing is completed. And then often post-construction, we would do an as-built ALTA of any, like, again, for this affordable housing project, all of the newly built improvements, and also based on a title report at the end of construction, which may show new easements and encumbrances that were recorded like during the construction of the project. ALTA just stands for American Land Title Association. That's the agency that governs the ALTA standards. Okay, looking at these other questions, why does it seem uncommon to pound a pipe or rebar at property corners for future and ongoing parcel reference? So, and that's a question I'll answer as it relates to a record of survey in a little bit. Does it matter which title company the client uses, or should not matter what title company the client uses. Any title company should be doing due diligence and doing a comprehensive title search on the property and coming up with all of the easements and exceptions that affect title. Aren't monuments most commonly in sidewalks or curbs, since roads get repaved and monuments would get lost? Not necessarily. Depends on the city. In San Francisco, they are mostly located on buildings or in sidewalks or on curbs. In Oakland, they're mostly located in the street intersections. In Berkeley, they're in the street intersections. On subdivisions, oftentimes the city or county requires them to also be located in the intersections. What is supposed to happen when there is road construction is that reference points are supposed to be set to memorialize the condition, the location of a survey monument prior to construction, so that if it is disturbed during construction, the reference points, which are typically set on the sidewalk or curbs, are there so that a future surveyor can retrace and put back the location of that monument. That's what practice should happen. So City of Oakland, for example, has a pretty good system for doing that, where anytime there's sewer construction, as part of the contract, the general contractor, they hire a surveyor to set those reference points and file the corner records with the county to memorialize those locations. Many cities and counties are not very good about maintaining their monuments. So, for example, City of Millbrae, certain parts of the city are notoriously, there's never any monuments to be found. And so in the absence of monuments, or when monuments are all destroyed, it's still possible to determine where the property lines are. It's just more expensive because we don't have those easy reference points to tie into. So then maybe we need to survey, the top of curb or the edge of roadway of this whole street or the whole block, like all 4 streets, in order to retrace the boundary. So monuments, the benefit of them is really just making it easier for the property to be retraced, but it doesn't always, they don't always exist. Oftentimes, older areas are the ones like Marin or Rinda, these kinds of neighborhoods are more likely to have the meets and bounds legal descriptions, and also are areas that are less likely to have monuments in the streets or anywhere to be found. So this is just a sample of an ALTA survey. On the left side, it shows the property boundary resolution. On the right-hand side, it's the topographic survey. And there's a bunch of notes in there, that show, what the title report says, what the exception to titles are, a table of encroachments, a certain format of surveyor's certificate, and a bunch of table A notes that are required for the ALTA. So touching quickly on subdivisions, a subdivision is when you want to subdivide a land into 2 or more parcels. It's always a 2-step process. The first step is filing a tentative map, typically with the city's planning department, city or county's planning department. And the tentative map is basically a topographic and boundary survey that's formatted to show some additional information that shows, for example, where your new lot line wants to be, whether there are any new easements that you want to record on the parcel or on the new parcel. Then the second step after the tentative map is approved by the jurisdiction is filing a parcel map or a final map. And the only difference between the parcel map or final map is how many lots you're creating. If you're creating 4 lots or fewer, that's a parcel map. And if you're creating 5 lots or more, it's a final map. Usually a final map has additional layers of approval. So for example, in San Francisco and Oakland, a final map will need to go to city council on their consent agenda in order to be approved and signed by city council, whereas the parcel map does not. Subdivisions can be land subdivisions, which is what most people are used to seeing, but they can also be subdivisions of airspace, such as condominiums. So a condominium is a 1-lot subdivision. So basically the land itself is not being subdivided, but the airspace above the land is being subdivided. So in that case, you really need 3 documents to all be recorded in order to create the condominiums. The final map, which shows the 1-lot subdivision, CC&Rs, and then the condo plan itself that shows, the individual units and how they're designated. Until all three are recorded, condos don't technically exist. There are also airspace maps and vertical subdivisions. This doesn't really occur in the single family setting, mostly sort of in a multifamily setting where, let's say you have a building where it's commercial on the ground floor and residential on the upper floors. Sometimes developers will want to do an airspace parcel map so that the ground floor is one airspace parcel, and then everything above that is the housing parcel and a second airspace parcel, and maybe the land parcel is even separate and that's owned by somebody else. Rachel mentioned that you guys are going to have a talk on SB9 next month, so that's another new bill that just became effective a couple months ago. And basically it requires local jurisdictions to approve qualifying development of up to 2 units on lots that are zoned as single family. So basically a lot that previously was zoned as single family could only have 1 unit on it. Now, if it qualifies, meaning it has to be in an urban area, and there's a whole list of other things, it can't be in a fire zone, it can't be in a flood zone, and other things, then if it qualifies, then you can either split the lot without having to comply with all of the old single family home, FAR, setbacks, minimum lot frontage, those kinds of things. You no longer need to satisfy those requirements. They have to ministerially approve the lot split. And so that will be, I'm sure, be coming down the pipeline for many of you soon for homeowners that are interested in doing that. So in that case, as it relates to surveying, obviously a topographic and boundary survey would have to be done, and then a tentative map would have to be filed, and then the final parcel map would have to be filed to show the lot split. Other survey matters, lot line adjustments, records of survey, construction staking, and quiet title actions. Lot line adjustments are to change the property lines of existing parcels, either combining them or altering the boundary between them. The limiting factor for lot line adjustments is that you can only include up to 4 parcels. So here's an example where the lot line split the parcel into 2 25-foot long skinny lots, and they wanted to reconfigure it so it was still 2 parcels, but they were 2 sort of more squarish parcels that were more usable. This is an example of a property in San Francisco that consisted of 34 historical lots. And the lots were never formally merged. And so this, unfortunately, you cannot do a lot line adjustment for, because even though we're merging parcels into one, it involves more than 4 original parcels. And so therefore it would require a parcel map to merge them. So record of survey, which sounds like a question that a lot of people are interested in. When is it required? So the Land Surveyors Act says that it is required when there's a material discrepancy found in the field that differs from recorded maps, or for retracement of lines that are not shown or ascertainable from recorded maps. So if we were to do a survey and we found that based on our retracement that the property line dimension was off by 2 feet, that would be a reason why you might record a record of survey. This second portion of this definition for retracements of lines not shown or ascertainable from record maps, one might argue, and some surveyors do argue, that that means that any meets and bounds description, because it's saying, oh, I'm beginning at this point, thence 200 feet to the easterly line of this deed from 1946, yada, yada. Some surveyors might argue that then that means any meets and bounds description requires a record of survey. The practical aspect of this is that homeowners don't want to pay for records of surveys because they're expensive to file, depending on the county that that the property is in, they receive a decent level of scrutiny from the county surveyor's office. So, you know, for example, we did a property in Napa where they wanted to file a record of survey. The survey itself was probably $5,000 to do. It was like a 4,000 square foot lot. And then the record of survey was another $6,000 to do. So it's easily, you know, double the cost because there's just much higher documentation requirements. Then we have to set property corners out at the lot. And so it is to the public benefit because then anyone in the future, it gets recorded, you know, in the record, and it is there for anybody, any surveyor or any future homeowner to see, but it is at an expense that, you know, the homeowner has to pay for. And so as a private surveyor, we would say that we don't really, I mean, we don't compel homeowners to file records of surveys. I mean, we obviously can't, but we can recommend when one may be helpful. So for example, we've done surveys where we've done work where there's been a dispute of where a boundary is, right? And so the client, the homeowner, chose to file a record of survey and set property corners to memorialize, you know, where we believe the property boundary to be, because if it ever became an issue of litigation, then he would have a recorded document that was reviewed by the county surveyor and recorded, and that would be, you know, evidence that he would use to back up the location of that boundary. I'm just going back through the chat to see if I've answered other questions about the record of survey. If I haven't answered your question, feel free to put it back down to the bottom just because there's quite a number of comments.
Hey, Jackie. Jackie?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know how much more you have in your presentation, but I'm just aware of the time, and usually, you know, I think we try to finish by around 1:30. And
Okay.
One thing I thought I'd throw out to you is if you, you know, if you want to and people are interested, we could do just kind of open it up for an actual dialogue rather than using the chat box.
Sure, yeah, that would be great. I mean, I'm pretty much done. You know, the rest of the stuff is pretty construction staking. The only thing I want to say about this is that, you know, so this is setting stakes in the field. Oh, the reason why this is relevant is also, you know, somebody had asked, you know, and maybe you guys have had experience asking surveyors to set property corners, and surveyors have been hesitant to do that. And they've said, well, we can stake the property line for you, but we're not going to set a corner. Practically speaking, you know, what it is in the field can be the same thing. It could be a nail in the corner. But as surveyors, if we set a property corner, then we are obligated to file a record of survey or a corner record. And so if for example, you want us to come out to stake the property line location so the homeowner can erect a fence, we typically would set those as offsets so that they can actually build the fence in the property line location. But also we don't want to set something that obligates us to file a corner record or record of survey, because that entails a much more expensive cost. So that's, and then the other comment about the construction staking is oftentimes homeowners will ask us, okay, well, I need to know where my property lines are. And then I also need to know, I also need you to mark it in the field. And when we send them a quote, they're often like, oh, why is it so expensive? Like, why do you have to come out twice? And we always tell them, you know, when we come out to do the initial survey, we don't know where the property line is. We are just basically collecting data that we then process back in the office to determine the property line locations. So anytime we do construction staking for a property line or anything else for, you know, an ADU, it's always the second visit, because the first visit is to collect the data to determine the property line location. And the second visit is to come out to actually stake the location of the property line. Quiet title actions are pretty esoteric, so I think I can probably just skip that. And yep, open it up to any questions.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is very simple. I don't know if you can see my picture, but this is so basic. But let's supposing that we have a site section, and the rectangle of my picture is the drawing. And so the site starts down here and it goes uphill until it comes up here. Now, if at the low end, I know the corner of the property, I think I know the answer to this, but still, if I measure up this hill and say the distance to the next property line is 100 feet and I know the direction, if I measure up the hill 100 feet, I will not be at the property corner, will I?
Oh, because it's a hill, no.
So are you then, when you're measuring that, so we get our property drawing and it's a tilted site or something like that, we can't just take those property boundary dimensions and measure them out on the field and actually get it exactly right, can we?
No.
And so when you guys are measuring it, if we start at this property corner at the bottom and go 100 feet, are you going level or are you going following some arc of the earth?
I mean, 100 feet is a pretty short distance. So the curvature of the earth only really gets taken into account when they're over long distances. So the 100 feet is the level distance, is the horizontal distance.
Thank you.
So John's question for a lot line adjustment, does the square foot adjusted have to be equal? Not necessarily. In certain cases, the city or county or for whatever the reason you're doing the lot line adjustment may require that, but that's not a precondition of doing the lot line adjustment. So you indicated that surveyors should come to the same conclusions from their measurements. Correct, dealing with controversy where both neighbors had surveys done, but neither sharing results. I mean, in theory, yes, but you know, whenever we've come into a situation where there's a boundary dispute and there's two surveyors involved, you know, the best thing is always for one surveyor to talk to the other to determine how they came up with it. Surveying is a very small profession. And usually, you know, and we speak the same language. And so it's a little bit, if the neighbor isn't willing to share the results of their survey, then there's no way they're ever going to come to common ground, right?
Jackie, can you talk a little bit about just the graphical quality of surveys? I've noticed, you know, when I have gotten surveys for projects, some of them just seem to have more information in them, and the graphic quality of the document, you know, it seems to vary widely from you know, from company to company. Can you talk about that a little bit?
In terms of the level of detail?
Both the level of detail and just the readability of the drawing. I mean, to be quite honest, sometimes I'll get a survey document and I look at it and it doesn't inspire confidence in me because the graphic quality just seems poor. You know, like the text used is kind of, you know, it doesn't read well, or it doesn't seem like it's placed very carefully, or, I mean, is there among surveyors, you know, is that something that you think about? I mean, you know, there must be like, you know, it obviously needs to be clear.
I mean, I do know a little bit about what you're saying. I mean, we have a certain level standard that we produce our surveys at, and obviously it's going to vary from company to company. But it's hard for me to say, you know, sometimes the title of the survey will be a little bit of a clue. So sometimes it'll say topographic survey. It won't say topographic and boundary survey, right? And so maybe there will show a property line, but then maybe there's just a note on the survey that says boundary was not actually resolved. This is shown like for graphical purposes only, you know? And so it's really hard to say without knowing what the scope of the survey that the client requested that yielded the document, you know? It's like they want, is it not showing elevations because they didn't want or specify that? Or did they actually do a on the ground survey? You know, those kinds of things. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I'm sure that the, the information that's contained in the drawing will affect how it looks, but I still have the sense that, between two different surveying companies, if you give them the same scope of work, you may get work product back that looks, noticeably different. So I was just wondering, I've just wondered about that.
Yeah, I mean, then you should hire the one that you like the work product better.
Your drawings look very good. I should say in that vein.
Thank you. Joshua's email or question: registered civil engineers with license numbers less than a certain number can legally do surveying. It's if your license was received prior to 1982. I don't know what number that is, but it was a long time ago. So I think most engineers who are around these days probably don't have a license number of that before 1982. Is there anything you'd recommend architects understand or think about when determining survey scope or anything else in general? I guess as it relates to survey scope, it's understanding, the surveyor is, we are tasked essentially with getting whatever information you need for your design use. So the clearer your scope is in determining whether you need, a full survey of the site, limited survey in this area, what kind of elevations you need, roof ridges, neighboring building corners and heights, those kinds of things. The more descriptive your scope is to us, the more able we'll be, able to get exactly what you need in the first go. It's really what information you need for your design use. So we try to always ask, okay, what is this for? What are you doing? But ultimately we're reliant on you as architects to determine the scope for us.
Any other questions? Looks like there's
I have a question. Jackie, you mentioned that you do not use satellite data. I don't know if other engineers do. Do you have an opinion as to how your field is changing?
Yeah, nowadays they're using drones and other types of equipment that is essentially making surveyors less necessary. People are able to, it used to be that we were like on the ground field surveys were always necessary, both for construction staking and for, just getting, gathering survey data. Now we're seeing that, essentially robotic and new technology is making it so that they don't need us as much anymore. But otherwise, other than that kind of gathering of data, I would say that the field itself in terms of locating property boundaries has largely stayed the same and will continue to stay the same.
Thank you.
Frank's question, the drone. No, the drone is actually in the field measuring the data.
Jackie, I'm trying to figure out if I should suggest that if people have further questions, they should reach out to you, but I don't want to have your inbox flooded with emails from a bunch of random people you don't know.
That's fine. I'm happy to talk to anybody who has questions.
Okay. Well, maybe we should wrap up. It's about 1:30. I'm sure everybody's got stuff they need to do. But Jackie, thank you so much for the presentation. I see some comments, praising your presentation. It was really good.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for all your questions. They were really great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for attending the meeting. I hope this was informative for you all, and you now have another resource for your survey questions for future projects. And I don't know, is there anything else that I need to say, Donald? Great.
Thank you both, Jackie and Mr. Lee.
Yes.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.